For example, when I think of the missing link, I actually think of the Piltdown Man, which is this whole other real conspiracy theory, and it was an actual hoax, which is interesting because if you read Laika's press release, they talk about this almost in a supernatural sense. When they talk about this creature and Hugh Jackman's character basically being sort of a supernatural or paranormal investigator, you wonder if they're sort of framing it around something like the Piltdown Man. Hello everybody, I hope you're having a fantastic day and welcome back to Buzzcuts, a channel where apparently we bring you the latest animation news so lately that is no longer the latest news, but just the most late news. I want to talk about a film that's just too exciting not to talk about, and frankly, hasn't really received the attention that it deserves. Now granted, there's not even a trailer to go off of yet here, but anytime that Laika so much as posts a tweet, I want to hear about what those folks are up to. And this past week, they released a pretty exciting press release with a lot of details, including cast and crew, plot, and a really exciting little teaser image for their next upcoming feature film, which even by their own definition is the most ambitious project to date. And that's saying something because Laika, in my mind, has done the most ambitious and well-integrated combination projects incorporating both CGI and stop-motion animation. Laika is basically the Aardman of the United States, and they're second place in terms of both output and box office for stop-motion animated films in the world. These are the folks who did most famously Coraline, Paranorman, The Box Trolls, and Kubo and the Two Strings. And their newest film is something that at very first caused me some trepidation, but you know, when I think about it more, I think it's an absolute perfect fit for this studio, and I'm really cautiously optimistic for this project. The film is called The Missing Link, and it must actually already be quite far through the development because it's scheduled for a spring 2019 release, which is really not that far away when you think about it for something that, you know, you have to animate frame by frame, where a few seconds of animation can take days and days or weeks of work. And even just based on the language of the press release, it sounds like they're really far through this thing. I think they mentioned having created over 150 physical sets, and anyone who's been following the studio noticed that they were doing some pretty heavy recruiting and basically building up their ranks for a few months now. So I think it's fair to say that this is the project that everyone there has been hard at work on for a number of months, and obviously they've already done all of the dialogue recording and everything, so I wouldn't be surprised if we see a trailer in the next couple months even. And it seems like The Missing Link is basically going to be a fantasy film with themes of science, maybe even religion, technology, history, and environmentalism. Like their past films, I think it's going to be stop motion with CGI enhancements. From my perspective, the more actual physical CGI, the better, but I have to say Laika does a better job of integrating the CGI than any other studio that I know of, in that when they have physical sets in the background, they tend to leave them really crisp and in focus with really complex dynamic lighting that is, you know, mimicked in the foreground and in the stop motion elements. That's my main beef with 3D CGI integration, is often the backgrounds just appear kind of blurry and flat, and you can really, it just almost feels like there's figures in front of like a projected image in the background. That's something that kind of bugged me about Corpse Bride. As beautiful as that movie is, and as much as I enjoy watching it, it just doesn't have the same tactile appeal as like the Aardman stuff. And I think Laika has really kind of moved past that in their art form, and I can't even often tell what is CGI enhanced and what is claymation. And I think a lot of that is because they do build physical sets and physical models, even if they, you know, composite them on top of each other or do different things to basically create more dynamic shots than they would be able to in a traditional 3D stop motion environment. And this is created by Chris Butler, who is the creator, both the writer and director of Paranorman, which I liked, but he's also the writer of Kubo and the Two Strings, and I thought that was a really, really solid script. So I'm excited to see what he can create with this project, being both the writer and director, with something that I guess is just a concept that appeals to me more. Heading up the cast is Hugh Jackman. It also includes Zoe Saldana, Zach Galifianakis, Stephen Fry, and Emma Thompson. Perhaps the most interesting thing about this announcement, though, is the title of the film, The Missing Link. And that's actually kind of a slightly controversial term as late, but historically it had a very different connotation than it does now. It's, in my mind, kind of a really outdated term that refers to the lack of evidence bridging primates or pre-human mammals and human-like mammals to the modern humankind. And I think most scientists now would characterize it as sort of an oversimplified expectation for an evidence of evolutionary biology, which we really don't need. I mean, we have much more nuanced understanding of of how that evolution happens. So looking for evidence of any one specific creature is just, it might back up the theory a little bit, but it's hardly required to provide evidence for that entire theory. We know now that there's lots of examples of that, but none of them are going to be as clearly defined as like the one mythological creature that is like the stepping stone between, you know, monkey and man. It's just not that simple. That idea, that simple kind of stepping stone idea, I think probably comes from like the early to mid 19th century, but the term itself actually goes back way before that to like literally ancient Christian mythology. I think actually like Aristotle and Plato arguably coined the term, but apparently it goes back to the chain of being, which is basically kind of a pre-modern science interpretation of like the relationships that separate like angels and demons from mere mortals, from plants and animals. But I do think the term kind of had a resurgence and was probably more common in the mid 19th century. For example, when I think of the missing link, I actually think of the Piltdown Man, which is this whole other kind of thing that essentially was a real conspiracy theory, it was an actual hoax, which is interesting because if you read Laika's press release, they talk about this almost in a supernatural sense. When they talk about this creature and Hugh Jackman's character basically being sort of a supernatural or paranormal investigator, you wonder if they're sort of framing it around something like the Piltdown Man, which was a creation of the infamous amateur archaeologist Charles Dawson in the 1800s. He basically manipulated that kind of early scientific community and falsified all kinds of basically creative, bizarre creatures, including like, I think one was, it was essentially a sea monster in the River Thames or something. So, you know, I mean, he basically dedicated his life to fooling people. But his most infamous creation was the Piltdown Man, and he created it basically by taking an orangutan skull and a human cranium and filing and changing and altering it and aging it. And it was something like 40 years before they could actually definitively claim with confidence that it was a fake. But The Missing Link, the film, is not going to be about a fake creature. It's going to be about a very real, endangered, mythological kind of creature, voiced by Zach Galifianakis. And this creature takes Saldana and Jackman and basically tries to find, I guess, their utopian origin, which is this place called Shangri-La. So it's basically a kind of a MacGuffin journey to this, you know, incredible, fantastical, untouched wilderness, presumably. So you can already see how many different kind of directions they could take this story. I mean, granted, it's a family film. It's not going to be, you know, too kind of complex in the plot department, but is it going to be more like Christian mythology, Indiana Jones, the Da Vinci Code? Is it going to be more kind of turn of the century, like Sherlock mixed with, you know, Twilight Zone? Or is it going to be like just a more playful, modern, colorful kind of children's fantasy feel? Again, the way they describe it with kind of the supernatural investigator stuff, it does make me wonder, you know, if it's going to be set in a particular time, if it sort of will have some contemporary traits. Maybe it'll start in modern day life. I don't know. It could be reality TV show inspired, or it could be inspired by, you know, centuries old scientific research, which would be kind of an interesting aesthetic for a kid's movie. Not something that I think has been done in the past, although certainly there's that sort of nostalgic sense of adventure that's been captured by films like Up that don't actually have like a firm date attached to them and aren't historical or, you know, scientific in the slightest, but, you know, still capture that spirit. It'll be interesting as we get more details and materials to see if that's sort of the direction that they go with The Missing Link. Specifically, like that 19th century is a really fascinating backdrop for any kind of story, but especially something with themes of environmentalism and, you know, understanding our place in the world. It was a pretty turbulent time for Christianity, with a lot of interest in kind of alternative forms of religion and spirituality, and frankly the occult as well. So, you know, it was sort of a time when people were searching for these mythical creatures that might explain our existence and our place in the world. Part of me also wonders the way they describe this, if it's going to be more, you know, Harry and the Henderson than the Lorax or something, just because it really does sound like a Sasquatch that they're hunting more than an early man. They do specify that it's set in like the Wild West Coast, so it's going to have a very, you know, Pacific feel. I believe Lake is based out of Seattle, so I'm sure everyone there is familiar with, you know, the incredible natural wildlife that we have up here, which really is, you know, it has sort of a mystical quality to it for a lot of people who didn't grow up here. And so I think it would almost be hard for them to avoid kind of taking a page from some Sasquatch lore. But the real question is, does The Missing Link mean anything for kids? And more importantly, does that whole prehistoric history, like, does it hold any interest for kids? I think we've seen other animated films do well that sort of flirt with that period in history. The Good Dinosaur is like completely not educational because it's, you know, this false version of history. That was very popular. I think probably the appeal was more the dinosaurs though, even than the human characters in a way. Aardman recently released, of course, Early Man, which grossed 50 million. It's not bad, nothing to scoff at, but only 10 million of that was domestic. And I don't want to harp too much on this kind of point again, but as I was describing in my Chicken Run 2 video, I think a lot of that honestly does have to do with the theme and the concept. When you're marketing a kids film, it has to be something that kids have a point of reference for, they're already excited about and interested in, and again, that's I think why something like Pixar's Cars does so much better than what I would argue, and I think a lot of people would argue, are much better Pixar films that just didn't quite have the same pull to justify, you know, the same like 3 or 6 sequels or whatever that Cars has now, including the planes and all the spin-off movies. So I think regardless of what the actual theme is that Laika is going for here, they're kind of playing it right by branding it as more of a fantasy film, which is why it might remain mysterious up until the point of its actual release. But even if it is about prehistory in a sense, I don't think they're exactly going to paint it that way when they're marketing this, especially to kids and families. And as you can see from the one teaser image that they've released so far, you know, they have this very kind of abstract, fantastical, friendly, earnest-looking creature who's sort of indicating for the viewer to be silent, the sense of mystery, but ultimately presenting it as sort of this warm, inviting, intriguing mystery and not something to be feared, and not something threatening in the slightest. The only other thing I've kind of find interesting about this announcement is that there's not inherently a character who is a younger protagonist. Usually, even if the main character is sort of an older person, you know, they throw in somebody who's younger for a younger demographic to relate to. And maybe that's Zoe Saldana's character. It's not really clear. She's a female adventurer who's sort of taken along for the ride. I don't know whether, you know, she basically invites herself or if she's recruited for her, you know, wilderness skills or something. And it's sort of unclear what the age of that character will be, but frankly, in the materials so far, they really have centered more on Hugh Jackman's character as this investigator. And I hope that nobody's scared away by my comparison to the Lorax. I mean that only in terms of like the very broad strokes, the basic themes. I know the Lorax wasn't very well received, although actually I think that's more probably in the execution than in the story. I think it was a fair adaptation of the Dr. Seuss story. It just sort of lacked some of that whimsy to me that Dr. Seuss really needs to thrive. And the animation wasn't, you know, my favorite in the world. But I still kind of feel like it's an underrated film in the big scheme of things. Of course, in the big scheme of things, there's a whole lot more movies, if you go outside of family or children's entertainment, that have a very similar kind of plot or theme to this, which maybe will be something of a challenge for Laika to overcome as well. I mean, just look at how many people complained about Avatar when that came out, with all the parallels it had to other plots that have been, you know, told for decades prior, and Avatar, believe it or not, is now almost 10 years old. So how do they make this really feel fresh and unique? Maybe you could argue it's a little bit easier for a kids film when the majority of your audience hasn't been exposed to that many previous films, but you know, you have to really satisfy an adult audience as well to thrive in this market these days. So there's a number of challenges for Laika. They have to make this fresh and original and unique without pinning themselves into a corner in terms of like the actual historical reference material or inspiration. They have to kind of define an aesthetic that really appeals to people and works. And depending on sort of which of those themes they pick up on, they have to do so without, you know, probably alienating either Christians or kind of the mainstream modern, generally accepted scientific theory that's sort of taught in public schools across the States. Now, pissing off Christians and scientists has always been a little bit of family entertainment, but there's a line there that you can't cross when you don't want to stir up unnecessary controversy and detract from, you know, the actual plot and the characters, which is ultimately what's going to drive any family film. But I think the good news is, if Laika's past work is any indication, they're absolutely the perfect folks to take on this sort of story. If you look at Coraline or Paranorman, they really straddle that line between something that's like dark and haunting and gothic in nature, or has a mysterious undertones, but is still really inviting and friendly for kids, and still feels really fresh and unique as well. A historically inspired, unapologetically fantastical, dreamlike kind of adventure set in a Wild West Coast setting is an absolutely perfect fit for Laika, and that is why I'm so excited to see The Missing Link. And I think it's something they'll be able to tackle with the right combination of creativity, nuance, and character. So given all those details that were just released, I'm kind of surprised how little I've seen of this film in the news so far, or here on YouTube. Were you guys anticipating this film before? What do you think of the new details? Does it excite you? Does it scare you? And what is your favorite Laika film from the past? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much again for watching. I'm Joseph, this is Buzzcuts. I appreciate your eyeballs today, and stay strange.